medical device clinical trials is facing a lot of challenges, and the biggest one that comes to mind is regulatory. So as Avi just mentioned, there are some regulatory changes in Europe. In fact, we did some of the maths and we found that in the past 5 years, there have been around 120K regulatory changes. So you can imagine there was a regulatory change every 20 minutes. So this is like the biggest challenge. Well, then there are other challenges as well. When there's regulatory, then there's the complexity of clinical trials. Well, like he just mentioned about variables. Well, it's so easy to get a drug trial, get people to try it, and find out, okay, this is more effective than the other. Now think about a medical device which is coupled with the software, and it's so hard even to find out, is it a software glitch even, or is it a patient glitch? So just as you mentioned about the watch thing, so the trials are getting more and more complex, and you have to keep up with that. Patients, how do you retain them and get them to work with medical device clinical trials? So all of this are adding a lot of challenges. So right from regulatory, your clinical trials, and then you have the whole lot of complaint factor into this, where there's so many complaints that come in and the clinical device has to be recalled, and then they have to go through a whole gamut of things of how to get that back on track again. While it might be a little more simpler if you have something that is like an imaging machine or something, but imagine if it's an implantable device. And to add to the mix, you have the cybersecurity scare. Where there's software, there is a cybersecurity scare. How do you deal with all that? And then there is, again, the identification of the person who's using that device. So you have the information of the person, which has to be de-identified, as you know. There are a lot of regulations around it. And again, these are very geo-specific regulation. Like regulation in California is different from the one in Texas. So there is, within US also, there are different regulations. And of course, there is Europe, and then there's whole global trend to it. So yes, these are like the top challenges. And then of course, there are more.
In the world of diagnostics, you built a product, and the product tested for something. So let's just think about a simple blood diagnostic first.
Yeah.
And it came back with an analytical result typically, right? You do a blood draw and you say, here's your HDL or LDL level. Well, it's for just an analytical result with no clinical claim. Anyone can do it, right? There's no need for a medical authority to get involved. Yeah, right. It actually turns out that even in the US, which is such an advanced country, we have a very, very large loophole in the US governance of in vitro devices, IVDs, which is called the CLIA Act, right? The Clinical Lab Improvement Amendment Act, which originated because doctors and providers, so hospital systems, said to agencies, you, the agency like an FDA, cannot be telling me that when a doctor takes a blood pressure reading, that somehow this has to be authorized by the FDA. He is both taking the manometer reading and making a clinical decision. But they wanted protection from that, so they had CLIA passed through Congress. It has become this giant loophole in a sense for labs to say, let us, working with a physician who will interpret the results on behalf of the patient, now take samples, do the analysis, build the quantitative result, and our physician will do the interpretation. So in effect, it's still a physician-patient relationship. There's been a lot of pushback for CLIA-developed tests versus IVD tests. And to the point that Seema made, it's this kind of a regulatory hodgepodge that we are seeing is creating more and more complex issues for med tech companies, medical device and diagnostics companies saying, how do we conform with a CLIA rule for guard bands in studies versus an FDA rule for show me absolutely what you got and what it means?